After the four presentations, there will be also a short time for questions. So we will have a microphone going through the audience for possibility of having questions to our speakers. So get your question ready. Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to welcome you back to the last section of the day. I will try to be short and efficient. We have four contributions, and this is a session that is supposed to be focused more on city, on spatiality and materiality. We have four presentations and four very distinguished speakers. We'll start with Richard Sennett. Actually, I'm very curious about Richard Sennett's presentation because I read the chapter and I think I didn't understand properly all that he said. I think it's a very interesting chapter and in which he draws an original parallel between playing a music instrument and making sense of the city, making the effort of giving meaning and having a sense of the space in the city. So he will hopefully clarify some passages that for my own ignorance about playing an instrument, I may have not gotten so clearly. He also maintained that the engagement of playing a musical instrument can tell us a lot about our engagement with the physical space and the physical space of the city, the way we make sense of the space we live in, the constraint and the opportunity that this space offers for making sense of life. Second, we will listen to Preteceille Galès presenting a chapter about the current dynamics of large cities in Europe. He takes an original stance in this analysis because he showed the robust resilience of European cities vis-à-vis the impact of globalization. Patrick confronts some common ideas, such as the death of the European city model or the Americanization of our city, and he charts an original interpretation, more nuanced interpretation of what is going on in our city. Also, the variation that is in the title reflects to his interpretation and discussion about the exception to the trends that he has singled out. And so he discussed the city, which shows as exemplary, as example of the trends he identified, and also the one that differentiate from this common trend. Then we have a contribution from Marco Oberti and Preteceille. In this contribution, they will look at the changes in the social structure of European cities, showing that the notion of social class, which at the moment is not very popular, but they show us how useful it is still to engage in social class analysis in the interpretation of what are the transformation of the social structure and the segregation patterns that reflect the new social structure. I think it's particularly interesting in their chapter, the analysis of segregation of privileged group, because we tend to look at segregation as the way poor people are confined in specific deprived area. Looking at segregation of privileged groups also gives us an entrance on the impact of that particular kind of segregation in the city. Finally, Enrica Morlicchio will use the city of Naples, which is a quite interesting city in Italy, as an example of the innovative and spontaneous form of solidarity and community alliances that are in the process of being produced in our city. And so we will end with a more optimistic view of what is going on and remarks about the future of the city that open up new hopes for the city themselves. Thank you very much, and I give you the floor to Richard Sennett.
No, Richard is postponing because...
okay. It disappeared. Oh. Okay. So I give the floor to Patrick. Yeah.
Yep. Good evening, and apologies for arriving late. In this chapter, I want to pay tribute to the great political economy of cities and territories that has been developed in Italy with different traditions, different current, but clearly the work of Enzo, together with some of his colleagues like Bagnasco and Triglia and many other ones, remain as a very important intellectual tradition to understand what is going on in territory based upon some old-fashioned discipline called political science and sociology and economic sociology. In many ways, I think this is important to remind that because nowadays in urban studies, the dominant group, our friend from critical urban studies, they are rather inspired by French philosophers, often dead, in order to think about, gentrification changing the world, massive urbanization, Henri Lefebvre and urbanization explaining everything, cities play no role whatsoever. I think what we have in this tradition of research, which may be more relevant in Europe than elsewhere, is trying to articulate transformation of capitalism and urbanization on the one hand, but also the deep social transformation of European societies, often based on some territory. So I think this is the core of what I want to argue, that we have to articulate those two and to keep this tradition, which implies that you have to do a lot of empirical work in depth and using all sorts of methodology. And again, I'm a bit upset sometimes to look at all these papers on the transformation of cities in Europe or elsewhere, where you are explained that it's a matter of assemblage, post-politics, neoliberalism, of course, always neoliberalism, and this explains everything without specifying the mechanism and with very weak empirical evidence. So let me pay tribute to this Italian tradition. Second point is we all argue that something is going on with the transformation of capitalism, and both with the transformation of finance, of the scale of globalization, of technologies, of changing societies, of migration, a lot of pressure are exerted on various cities and on the urban world altogether. So what is going on is a big issue and a big question. Plus, we have had in Europe, more than in some other parts of the world, more than in Latin America or Asia, a very deep economic crisis since 2008. That has been an opportunity for a lot of restructuring of various elements of European societies. So my question is, what happens to European cities? Some years ago, 15 years ago or something, I was part of a group that tried to identify a particular model of European cities based upon very strong policy, lots of politics, public-private partnerships, strong legitimacy, a lot of robust welfare state, middle class and lower middle class of the public sector, a particular kind of collective actor and agency that made huge transformation and that led to very strong dynamism of those European cities, mainly mostly regional capitals from 300,000 to 2 or 3 million inhabitants. And this, as we know, this model is a long-term model that has characterized European societies. The book was finished by saying there's two scenarios now. What happens? Scenario one is a scenario put forward by New Economic Geography and trade economists. And they have told us that when you create a space for a big market, you have a relocation of economic activities. So therefore, over 30 or 40 years, the making of the EU and the rise of more economic relations in Europe should lead to the transformation of European space a bit like the US, with two big metropolis, like, I don't know, Istanbul and London, and a carnage of middle-sized city. So the European model was seen as obsolete, in the word of Castells, completely marginalized, not competitive with Shanghai or Los Angeles. The alternative scenario was to argue that maybe mid-sized cities with a strong social dynamics and political capacity, there will be some capacity for this European model to adapt and to transform over time. So in many ways, the crisis of 2008 and the 10 years since, 8 years since, was a great opportunity to see what is going on in European cities because of the strength of the economic crisis. So what do we know? What happened over the last 10 years or so when you look at European cities? And again, we have quite a literature arguing that the mix of crisis, neoliberalism, and everything explain that this model is going down the tube with massive cuts and everything. The problem is it's not what is going on. So I'm using some of the figures from the EU has done the State of European Cities, which for the first time is using new statistics and a lot of very, very good group of researchers. So I recommend this document. I rarely recommend EU literature, but you should do that. So what do we know about what has happened in Europe? Point one, European cities are doing very well on average. On average, okay, average. The robustness of the model has been quite remarkable. When you look at these mid-sized cities, these regional capitals, the bulk of European cities, on average, you have a remarkable growth in economic terms, in demographic terms mostly, and more importantly, the gap between those cities and the rest of the country is increasing. So life expectancy is growing in cities. Poverty is less important in cities than in the rest of Europe. The productivity is increasing dramatically in the bulk of European cities by contrast to the national model. So there's an effect of metropolization which is benefiting a lot from European cities. So basically, despite the crisis, the model is remaining remarkably robust by many, many accounts, including politically, where all the indicators of local autonomy, except in the UK, are showing increased capacity for local actors to develop some policies. But there are three strong nuances or even counterfactuals to this general story. The first one is that it's not true everywhere. The model itself is less encompassing. What we see in Oriental Europe is that outside the national capital, most of regional cities and capitals are in decline. And shrinking cities are also taking place in Eastern Germany. So there's one part of Europe where beyond the national capital, the rest of the territory is rather declining in urban terms. The second, of course, is the south of Europe, and the story of the south of Italy, of Spain, and Greece most dramatically, where all the austerity measures have led to much more difficult situations. And the third one is the continuous decline of old industrial city, particularly small one, and mid-sized, like 50,000 industrial cities are in sharp decline all over Europe, and in particular in the old industrial cities. So there's a story which remains pretty robust, but with those strong nuances, three important set of nuances and counterfactual that should be taken in mind. However, keep that in mind. When we look at all this transformation, this model is remaining robust. Second empirical element to keep in mind is, we have neoliberalism, we have welfare cuts, and God knows we think there's too many inequalities and we're interested to study that. But the story of Europe is not a story of massive inequalities increasing over the last 10 years. And Marco and Edmond will say something. I was this summer with Edmond at the ASA in Montreal, and when Edmond explained that social segregation was very problematic but relatively stable in France, American colleagues could not believe it. But Europe is not the US. Can I repeat? Europe is not the US. So when you look at the evolution of public expenditure and welfare expenditure in Europe, what you see is no massive cuts, is small cuts in a few cases and a rather very strong stability or increase since 2008. So stop arguing that massive welfare cuts everywhere. No, it's stable with some pressure, small decrease in some case. Surprisingly, because I'm an old-style Weberian, I think urban policy and public policy matter. Surprisingly, when you look at the Gini coefficient and the increase of inequality, both in cities and at the national level, surprise, surprise, what do we see? Well, those inequality increase massively in the Baltic state and in the 2 or 3 countries more hit by the crisis. But in the majority of European countries, income inequality is either stable or reducing in most European countries. Because of what? Because of a lot of public policy and welfare state and housing policy. So we are in Europe in a situation where we don't know which way we're going to move. Maybe in 10 years, the picture will be different. But so far, please stop arguing that we have massive welfare cut, neoliberalizing is transforming the world, and everything is changing fast. This is not what is going on. Third type of evidence, when you look at figures related to homicides, violence, life expectancy, and those kinds of figures, you realize that the rate of homicide in cities, a very good indicator for violence and social relations, is going down dramatically in most European cities since 2002, except in the Baltic state. The rate is it's 4 or 5 times more in US cities. By the way, the rate of incarceration of people, except in England, is relatively stable in Europe as well. So there is no turn of punitive state. Our friend Luc Wacon is completely right about the US. He's probably in part right about the UK. He's completely wrong about Europe. So we are a strange place where those elements. I'm not arguing that poverty has increased. We have 25% at risk of poverty. We have more discrimination and problems with immigrants. We have lots of problems to solve. But the bulk of the European model still today has not collapsed. And that has very strong implication both on the type of cities we have, on the social composition, on the type of inequalities we have to deal with, and on the future of the model. To conclude on my little argument on these things, I want to argue that, of course, there are a number of issues that are at stake. And one of the, for me, most important issue is the fact that what we see in the US, like in Europe, like in the US, is reduction of social mobility, and the stabilization of social mobility is a big problem in European cities, in European countries, like we see in the US, where it's completely stable now in many ways. And what we start seeing also is something similar, and for me it's one of the most important issues, is that we see some element of metropolization. We see that those living in cities are enjoying much better life, they are now having better and better conditions, and the rate of social mobility is increasing. Even in Paris or in France, a working class kid living somewhere in the countryside has a very small chance to become a manager. If the same working class kid lives in Paris and Paris urban region, it increased by 40% its chance to become a manager. So social mobility becomes associated to spatial mobility. But if you have more and more housing difficulties, as we have in a number of cities, and if you reduce income tax and inheritance tax, so those inequality of ownership increase over time, you prepare over time massive cleavage and massive mechanism of inequality in the making. So my conclusion is we do not have a neoliberal, massively cuts, whatever, cities in Europe. The model remains robust, but we see small incremental process that over time, especially associated to housing, I would argue, and the labor market, are likely to produce long-term massive inequalities. I think the two scenarios are still on the map, and we'll see what happens next. It will depend a lot of public policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. There is a lot to discuss about. Richard, are you up to, or you want to postpone?
I'm sorry to leave you beforehand. I had a fall outside, and but it's nothing serious. Several whiskeys won't fix. That's the one thing every conference needs is a bottle of whiskey, I think. I want to explain to you the rather strange paper that I have contributed to this volume for my friend Enzo Mingione. And the bridge between this paper and your concerns here today is the translation of the terms embedding and disembedding into the domain in which I work, which is urban design, urban development, the physical world of the city. That translation is that for us, the word disembedded means dematerialized. And the word embedding means a materialization of people's experience of the city. And the problem that for us in the world of urban design and planning, concrete planning, is how to re-embed people in a sense of place by having a better sense and a better way of designing physical experience in the city, notably the experience, the tactile, the haptic experience of physical places. I put this abstractly, but this is a question that faced us, planners and urban designers, last year in creating the program, our part of the program for Habitat 3, which is the United Nations colloque, which happens every 20 years to assess the state of the built environment. And part of I was one of the organizers of that. And the problem for us was that many urban designers and architects today don't have a very good sense of how to embed, that is, how to create structures which materialize, which give people a material sense of the environment. And I'm going to show you what the problem looks like. This is a space in which has got good haptics. This is the Silicon Alley of Delhi. It's a space called Nehru Place, and there is a parking garage below this. This is something we funded through United Nations Development Fund. I should say I work with the UN for 30 years now, and this is a project I'm very proud of. This is a parking garage below, originally meant just to be empty above, with on the side where you see the, I'm sorry, I can't do this very easily, where you see the buildings there are the maker spaces, are the places in which high-tech startups in Delhi are occupied. And what happened with this space is that it was informally used. It became a market. You can buy an illegal iPhone, like this one there, which just happened to fall off the back of a truck. You can buy saris. It is, there's a movie house which shows the same film dubbed into 7 languages. It's also a place at night for many of the pavement dwellers in Delhi. It is a space in which people are physically very comfortable with being with each other, including the hotshots who are in these buildings on the side, who are trying to do these tech startups. It's not true in India that only Bangalore is a center of tech culture. Delhi is as well. And this is a kind of place that has physically, in which people's haptic experience, their sense of physical presence, of touching, literally, touching people unlike themselves is very, very strong. Whereas this project, and I'll come back to this too, this project in Beijing Another project we financed, this one through the IMF, and I'm not responsible in any way, shape, or form for this, is a space that is lacking the qualities of sensual engagement, of physical engagement of people with each other. This is a wildly expensive development. At first, very, very satisfying to the people in Beijing because there was a horrible housing crisis. It is now starting to develop all the social ills of big housing estates in Western countries, like, I have to go the other way. I'm so bad at this stuff. Like this, the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago, which was the American prototype for this. High degree of drug use. There's actually a great deal of alcoholism in this state, very unusual for Chinese, because it's a very deracinated environment, and people complain about the fact that there's no physical presence, there's no shared life on the ground plane where people can congregate. It's an isolated environment. And so the question for us was how it is that we are in the process of protecting this space. It's about to be declared a UNESCO monument. Doesn't look like it, doesn't look like the Duomo here or any part of Venice. But the idea about this is very threatened by gentrification. Google wants to actually buy the garage, which would be a way of beginning to clear all these people out. And we are trying to protect this and find another way to develop this. And the question is how to do it. I thought that the only intersection I can see to the economic arguments here is that that have been presented here today, is that this is a space that was originally invested in because the investors saw a target of opportunity very specific to this place. They saw that making a garage here, it's 3 stories in the bottom, would be, and with these buildings on the side, would be a way of creating an informal and porous environment in a part of Delhi, which was formerly very segregated. And this could open up this environment. They were able to convince people in the UN to do this because they had a lot of local knowledge about what was possible and not possible here. Whereas this space was something in which local knowledge was irrelevant. This was, it's a public-private assemblage, and it began with a set of specifications for its housing, and then the investors looked at where in Beijing they could make this investment. And thanks to the Communist Party, they were assigned this place. This was formerly a hutong, if any of you know what that is, which is a kind of cellular development of courtyard houses. Erased, the word chai, which means destroy, was put on the hutong, and it's a huge hutong settlement, and 2 weeks later it was graded flat, and this began. The difference between these two is the difference between opportunity investing and what we call in the UN core investing. That is, investing in specifications and then finding a place to realize those specifications. It is the difference between something which is not necessarily local knowledge in the sense that it's all about developing community, but it's about seeing opportunities by knowing the specific conditions of various places in the city through versus something which is more globalized and in which the actual knowledge of the city is of secondary importance to the calculation of the specifications for these buildings. As it happens, the primary investor for this part of Beijing was a group in Kuala Lumpur. Only one person in that group had ever visited Beijing before. So that it's a, if I think about the relationship to the discussion today, it's that for us, you are more likely by this globalized form of investment to produce this, whereas this takes something that is a completely different orientation, where you see value in the city and then you assemble the finances to develop that value. I could go on about this endlessly. I just want, but I do want to point out one thing. The model for this is not something that's part of the global economy. It comes from the Plan Voisin for Paris in 1924 of Le Corbusier. And discussions about globalization, at least in our domain, are misleading in the sense that for us as designers, the prototype for producing Beijing was there and in the West long, long before there was anything like globalization. This is a plan to grade flat the marais, to scroll chai in French. I don't know what's the word in French for raise flat. Éraser. Écraser? Éraser. His notion was you get rid of the marais, you get rid of this complex fabric. So wait a minute, I can't show you all this. I'm going the wrong direction, hold on here. The idea of this is this is Corbu's idea of modernity. That it's a modernist vision. Each tower is extremely beautiful. I'm sorry I can't, because I want to show the urbanistics of this. I can't take it to the detail of it. But the point about this is that for us, this is deeply ingrained in the way we are trained to see modern building, right? This looks modern, whereas something like this, which is another open space, this is in Dharavi, another part, this is Mumbai, which we're also trying to protect. We actually want to make this a space that can't be developed. This looks old. So the problematic for us was how to recover a sense of designing this. And that's where this paper on touch comes in. It's not self-evident because it's so deeply ingrained in the nous of architects to make these Corbusian spaces, that how we go about recovering the tactile, touching qualities in urban design. And the work that we've done in Habitat 3, which is published next Tuesday, presents about 25 different case studies for how to do that. All of them are predicated on something which is why I sent you this paper, which is that recovering a sense of touch is nothing that's easy. You have to learn how to have a sense of physical relationship with an environment, just as you have to learn how to have a sense of physical relation with a musical instrument. It's the same problem. Here, in Nehru Place, for instance, something that would be very striking to an anthropologist would be that people who are Muslims and Hindus who occupy different terrain here. I bought this illegal iPhone from somebody who happened to be Hindu, but there was somebody at another another stand who was a Muslim saying, no, don't go to him. I give you a better price. Those people coexist, and they coexist physically. The same thing is true with the night dwellers in this space. That is a huge crowd of people who have nowhere to sleep. They can't even get spaces to sleep in the ghettos of Delhi and sleep on this pavement after the market is over. Those are also sleeping Hindu and Muslim bodies next to each other. And that has taken them experience about, for instance, that the men can touch and men and women never touch. That's learned behavior. It's something built into them about what should be resisted and what can be what we would call informal and spontaneous behavior. And what I've done in this paper is try and show you the ways in which we learn how to have that tactile, haptic sense with other people. My paper, unfortunately, is not aimed at you as political economists, but at designers, urbanists and urban designers, for whom any contact is good, in which the haptic senses, the senses of touch, are unmediated, in which the physical realm of the city is something that is in the body naturally. And that's the wrong way to think about it. That the physical realm is learned, just the way any other aspect of the city is learned. And to make better urban design, urban designers, architects, planners, have got to learn again ways of being physical with other people in order to create spaces which are haptic and physical. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now the floor is to Edmond and Marco.
Good afternoon. How fragmented are our fragmented societies in these times of dominant financial accumulation and neoliberal policies? That's a question that we try to answer in the paper by looking at three interconnected themes. One is a discussion of the relevance of social class analysis. The second is the importance of urban segregation and urban inequalities in the constitution of living condition and different life chances for different social classes. And the third part is how this is mediated, partly produced, transformed by public policies and what we call welfare regimes in general. The paper is too long to be presented, so we decided to just show you bits of one particular argument, one part of the social class structure, which is the issue of middle classes throughout those three parts. Why choose the middle classes? We discussed the other classes in the paper, but we thought that this would be a little more exotic because they've been absent largely of the discussion up to now. Also because we think that they should be part of the picture when we discuss political issues, when we discuss urban issues. and also because, in a sense, they are understudied and controversial issues. There are discourses about the disappearing middle classes, where most of the empirical data show expanding middle classes, so we have to look at it a little more carefully. Well, discussion about social classes first. To discuss the middle classes, we need a number of theoretical guidelines, but we also need a lot of empirical work and empirical tools to be able to understand how the transformations of the economies of our countries have been over the years, and increasingly in the recent period as well, producing different sorts of middle classes, and what are the changes in the conditions of these middle classes. So, expansion. Second, definitely changing positions of the middle classes within the general relations of production of the capitalist system. It used to be the case that the majority of middle classes were people in an intermediary position between the ruling class and the working class. Intermediary in terms of hierarchy, in terms of power, etc. It's more and more the case that large parts of the middle classes are in fact today no longer people with any hierarchical position of power over other workers, but people who are themselves first direct producers of services, and secondly, there are also key elements in the definition of the productivity of the businesses they work for, be they public or private services. And therefore, they progressively lose the relative advantages they had in terms of labor contracts, labor conditions as compared to the working class, and are progressively more and more touched by greater control, stronger forms of evaluation of their productivity, greater productivity pressure, greater precarization of their labor contracts, etc. This is a general movement, unequal among the different parts of the middle classes, which opens a series of questions about the changing relations of those middle classes with the working class, the different parts of the working class on one side, and the upper class on the other side. How do we answer that question of the changing relations? It cannot be a theoretical answer. It's only by observation, data, survey that we can really see how things are changing in the firms and in the city. That's the last point I will present before giving the floor to Marco. The middle classes, particularly the middle classes and the lower middle classes, are very interesting in terms of their position in the city. They are the least segregated social categories, which means they are the categories which are more mixed with all the others, which are less living in separate conditions of their own. In a sense, you could say that this might undermine the progressive emergence of a class for itself in terms of living condition of the working class. But at the same time, it means that there are potentialities for different sorts of relations between the working classes, the middle classes, and the working class particularly. And this is one of the, let's say, more controversial issues, because in a large part of the literature, you have a discourse about the middle class in singular being largely the main actor leading segregation through gentrification, gated communities, etc. The empirical data about middle classes in the city shows the opposite. So we have to look more carefully about that. It's not only the prominence of the US model. I think it's a lack of detailed analysis by us sociologists that we have to improve. Marco.
Hello. First of all, I would like to thank Alberta, Yuri, and David, where I don't know where is Yuri, for editing the book and for organizing the conference. So it's really a great pleasure to be here and to celebrate Enzo Mingione's career or intellectual trajectory. And it's very important for me because my first contact in Italy was Arnaldo Bagnasco, and I met Enzo in Dipartimento di Scienze Sociali di Torino, and I have to say that it was very complementary for me to have both Bagnasco view on the Italian society and Enzo Mingione view, and in particular, not only about the difference between Mezzogiorno and the rest of Italy, but in the way of thinking about, and not thinking only at one scale. And this is, for me, being a French scholar, the main lesson from the Italian sociology. So to be very sensitive to the territorial approach and to be able to connect different levels of analysis in terms of space and social differentiation. So so thank you, Enzo, for giving me the possibility of having both Bagnasco and Mingione to understand a very complex and complicated society. Well, just to complete Edmond's presentation, I would like to take the example of education. Education is a good example of to reflect on the complexity of the interweaving between urban inequalities, segregation, and welfare state regime, and to reflect and to try to give answer on middle class issues. In fact, many comparative analyses on education are based on very often national level, using, of course, national survey, national data, and using very often a national definition of the welfare state. And I think that this is, we have to be aware about the limit of using this data on reflecting on a comparative perspective on education. And very often the research based on that data are not very sensitive to local arrangements, which participate in producing significant differentiation among space in one national or metropolitan configuration. This is the case, for example, for the well-known PISA survey. I don't know if you know this survey, which is, of course, a very useful survey, but not well elaborated to capture regional, metropolitan, or local differentiation, and contributes to consolidate homogeneous national view of each educational system. This is particularly true for the French educational system, which is very often perceived very homogeneous with weak territorial inequalities and differentiation. But when we look carefully, having in mind what Patrick said before about the fact that French and many European societies concerning segregation are not the US, but when we look very carefully at the local level, we see strong differentiations in terms of social and ethnic compositions of different levels of school, in terms of school offer, diversity and attractiveness of specific curriculum, seniority and qualification and skills of teachers, school trips, etc., etc. And of course, in terms of school performance. In Paris suburbs, for example, it's very common to find in a quite limited area one public middle school with more than 60% of pupils from upper middle class background, and very close, another public middle school with only 8% of pupils from that category. Same thing for school performance. One school, for example, having more than half of pupils succeeding at the final exam with the best honors, and the second one with only 9%. So from 60 to 9, which is, a huge difference. And the global result, mapping both social composition and school performance, give a very complex picture of the situation with big contrast at the local level. And if I will have the time, I will show you the map showing exactly the complexity of the situation. But of course, just before presenting the second point, 2 weeks ago, I was called by the city of Mantova, very close to Milan, to present my work on school segregation in Paris suburbs. And I have to say that I was quite surprised why a little town, city like Mantova, asked a French sociologist to present their research on school segregation. But why? Because in Mantova, there is a very high segregated neighborhood with a lot of immigrants from Africa, and they are reflecting on the impact of this situation of a high level of ethnic segregation at school or for the local community. And it was exactly the same thing for other Middleton in Europe. So, just again, having in mind that Europe is not the US, but speaking about school segregation, there is an increase of the preoccupation concerning this issue. Going back to my argument and the French situation, of course, what I'm saying about social and ethnic composition and school performance deal with segregation. And the specificity maybe of some European context is the gap between residential segregation and school segregation. So why, for example, in a society like France, where there is a quite rigid school catchment area policy, you have not exactly the reflection of the local social structure at school. It's because there are mechanism, processes, what are very important to understand, in particularly for middle class. And education is exactly a good example to show how important it is to make a distinction between upper class, upper middle class, and lower middle class. In fact, the analysis of school strategies and residential choice show that there is a significant difference and a crucial qualitative impact on social relations and political issues. Again, according with local environment, the way that upper middle class are dealing with school and social and ethnic mix participate in understanding inequalities and the kind of inequalities you find at the local level. And we have now a lot of fieldworks in London, Chicago, Amsterdam, Brussels, Berlin, Bogota, Mantova, showing this local social game and its impact on school inequalities. This is why your main argument in the chapter written with Edmond is that the understanding of these complex local arrangements is a big issue for social scientists and politicians interested in inequalities. Okay, so I will stop here. I would like to say other things on Enzo's contribution and the impact of ESOPO experience, because just few words, because there are a lot of people participating in this big European comparative research, and it was exactly the same way of reflecting on local arrangement. The chapter I wrote with Enzo about the local welfare system, comparing minimum income support policy in 10 or 12 European cities. I don't remember exactly the number. Okay, so a significant number of European cities. So thank you again for your contribution on thinking about comparison.
Thank you very much. We have two discussants, Professor. Oh, sorry. I spoke of Naples before and then I forgot. Enrica. Enrica, the floor is yours.
We are at the end of this long day, so everything has already been said about Enzo Mingione. But I just want to add a few words on Yuri, Alberta, and David, because I knew them since they were many decades ago, since they were brilliant PhD students. And now they are becoming international influential academics. And so I think that once at the end of the academic life, one stops teaching, but of course you do not stop writing books, lecturing, and doing a lot of these things. But most of all, I think that one do not stop being a mentor. You are a mentor for all the life. And I think that you have been, as all of us have recognized, a generous mentor, not only for Yuri and David and Alberta, but for an entire generation of Italian sociologists. So thank you very much. And my contribution in the book is based on the Napolitan case. And it is very difficult to summarize all the contributions. So I just want to point out the fact that the Naples is interesting because it has a very complex social spatial structure in which we can identify almost 3 different areas with the following paper that I wrote with Enrico Pugliese. We call the Wilson City, that is the northeast part of the city, where we can find some aspect of the syndrome of deprivation described by Wilson in terms of the effect of concentration. And so we can find some of the characteristics of the hyperghetto. And there is another areas that we call the Alum City, which is the historical center of the city, where we can still find the traces of the alley economy, and that is urban economy of subsistence based on informal exchange of services and goods. And there is a third city that we call the fourth city, that is the eastern and the western part of the city, hit by the industrialization, and where the process that is very similar to other areas in the North Europe, where the process of revitalization has not yet started. That is perhaps the most important difference with the similar areas in other North European cities. And there is also a fourth area that I do not mention in the book because it's very difficult to explain to non-Italian people. That is the residential area of neighborhood like Posillipo Vomero, where the upper class families live. And we call the city of Posto al Sole, that is a very popular soap opera in Italy. Even in this residential area, the interaction between upper class families and families from a different background are very, very intense, very frequent. So this complex social spatial structure of the city prevents form of severe segregation and social isolation. Although, as already known, the level of unemployment and of poverty in the city are still very high, and the quality of the welfare system and of the transport infrastructure is very, very low. And this creates a sort of imbalance in the precarity that I think it is the reason why the case of Naples is very interesting, because it is able to achieve a high level of social cohesion, even in presence of a low level of economic development. And Serena thought that I was quite optimistic because I stressed in my contribution the fact that the structure of the social spatial structure of the city foster a sort of daily interaction that is very similar to which you mentioned for the case of Nehru Place, Delhi, that where people coexist physically and they create what also Ashamin and Igor Swift called the togetherness. Yeah. So the capacity to live together, to share the same workplace that is the pavement, for example. Is when I arrived very early in the morning to my university, that is at the historical center of Naples, you can see immigrants, workers, and Italian workers, Neapolitan workers, they are street vendors. That started the long daily day together, and they go to take a coffee together, or they talk each other, and they, for example, talking on football team, and so they have a very strict daily interaction. But I am not so optimistic as Serena thought, because I think that these forms of togetherness is not enough, because we need also to a politics of redistribution and of recognition that is based on a common system of duties and obligation and rights and social rights. And that is what is now lacking in the city. And so although my contribution was mostly descriptive, I think that it has two theoretical implications that is very strictly related to Enzo's work. The first one is the variety of forms of embeddedness, and we have seen that there are a lot of forms of embeddedness, disembeddedness, and also the ambivalence of this process. I find very interesting the notion of moral economy from above, from Lydia Morris, because the moral economy is very ambivalent. It was a form of protection from the community, but it was also discretional, paternalistic, and it was part of a system of feudal obligation, and that excluded some people as undeserving poor. For example, do you remember the Scarlet Letter? No? So the protection was guaranteed to married women or widow women, but not, for example, for lone mothers. Mostly servants made pregnant by the landlord. And so I think that we should not, we should be very careful when we are looking for a new form of moral economy. And the second theoretical question is on the representation on the unrepresented people, because what the Napolitan case teaches us that this type of social structure prevent the forms of political organization. And the only forms of protest is very similar to the riots that Thompson studied during the moral economy. And so it is very important to think on how we can find new forms of representation of people that at the moment are very difficult to be represented. And the only form of voice that they have is the form that they can explicit during their daily interaction. Okay.
Thank you very much, Enrica. Since we have some time, before giving the floor to our two discussants, Professor Nuvolati and Professor Balducci, I would like to give the microphone to the floor and see if there are questions that can be answered after the discussion. There is a microphone going around. Okay, Simone has it. And you just, okay, Alona?
Yeah, maybe, sorry. Maybe I also misunderstood the presentation of Richard, but I have sort of a feeling that you, without any critiques, value the local knowledge as something good. But if the local knowledge is about like sexism, if local knowledge is about discrimination, if local knowledge is about like inequality of some, and especially if we're talking about India and caste system, like, so the question is, how do you evaluate this local knowledge you were mentioning in one of the projects? Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's worth collecting few questions and then giving possibility to answer to our speakers. No more question? Well, maybe I should give you the opportunity after this discussion. Okay, so you want to start? You want to start? Okay.
Well, this is a really good question you ask, and a very difficult one, because the local is something we make a shrine of in some forms of urban design when it shouldn't be. What I'm explaining to you about the economics of this is that there is a very different set of attitudes towards the city between these two forms of investing. In some way, the opportunity investing is better since it's more oriented to a particular place. But that's a limited good. I certainly don't, in my own work, this is a big divide with Jane Jacobs, who was a friend and a teacher, but whom I think made a shrine, a kind of a totem out of local knowledge. And local knowledge can be, as you point out, can be extremely hurtful and so on. So the problem for design, for our work, is how to engage the local rather than impose on it, but still be critical of it when it does things that the designer thinks violate larger norms. And there's no recipe for that. When I worked in Beirut after the Civil War briefly, and the local knowledge there is of mutual hatred. And the designer, we were trying to recover a devastated city, had to not say, well, this is wrong that you hate each other, that would be infantile, but to withdraw from taking that knowledge seriously and saying instead, well, there's no electricity here, and this was in the so-called Green Line where we worked, and you have to cooperate with each other if you want to be able to turn the lights on. So there are various ways of dealing with this. There is no universalistic, any planner who says, I know the way to plan whatever the local conditions are, which is morally correct, is somebody who will be out of work. So the question is how to mediate and respond to that when local knowledge is destructive knowledge. If I can just say one more thing about it, in the United States, it's the same problem with Trump. Trump invokes a kind of local knowledge. It's one of his, he's a cursed genius, but he's very good at invoking the sense of we locally. To say to him, oh, you're a sexist, racist pig, which is true, does nothing to deal with the situation that he's provoked. And what I think we need to do in politics, just as we need to do in urban practice, is find a way to engage the local, but not over-identify with it, nor cause local people to feel, oh, they don't get it. They have no shame. And it's a diplomatic problem, it's a moral problem, but it's very nuanced. So this is a wonderful question you put, the answer to which is there is no single answer for that. You know, it has to be dealt with in a range of ways. In my book, my new book, I deal with this in terms of dialogics rather than dialectics. You know, dialogic process of working with the other rather than convincing the other. But it's very important that you raise this.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you to Alona for the question. So we have Professor Balducci. He is one of the few non-sociologists here. Oh, so we value very much your contribution.
I don't know if this works. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I am not a sociologist. I'm an urban planner. So I'm looking to the sociological studies for getting analysis and inspiration to act and to try to change things. And of course, also you have to forgive me if I'm not technically precise discussing these very interesting papers that I've been able to read before. And of course, much of this inspiration has been also by Enzo and his work, which has been, and I thank him for the work that he has done. Okay, so first of all, I'm very close and very admired by the paper of Richard Sennett, and it was this fantastic metaphor of music and how music can inspire us in understanding the concept of embeddedness and disembeddedness. And I think that the interesting thing in this paper is that there is a discussion of a number of issues that in the circles of planners and architects have been already raised, but shedding a lot of lights on some aspects which have not been discussed. First of all, for example, the separation of traffic, but also the idea that separation of traffic is not just the issue of having cars and people in the same place, but that the cars are boxes in which people are put inside in order to avoid and impair this kind of exchange and personal exchange. The separation of functions as a way of making the city more efficient and more capable of working, but also killing the social dimension that comes from interaction. The architectural machines, which are looking mainly at the form that can be used only in one way, it says in this paper, and become rigid, inadaptable, incapable of hosting the change of society, and in particular, all what we have been producing in the 70s or end of the 60s and early 70s has been something that has been designed to be the best efficient, and they are the least efficient now, because now we have to rebuild hospitals, to rebuild schools, and a lot of things that have been built in that period because they are not able to be adapted. And also the idea of user-friendly, which has been also interesting. There is a book of Laura Balbo, which was very important in a certain phase, and he says that this idea of user-friendly, so to produce something with the idea of making it easy, is also a way of constraining a kind of use that cannot engage people, which is one of the most important issues. And also the idea of predictable and unpredictable in the city, which is also a very important point. So I would add also something else, like lower density. I've been deputy mayor for urban planning for a short period of time here in Milan, And one of the mantra here is to lower the density because we wanted to avoid the speculation. But when you lower the density, you also produce some kind of neighborhoods in which nothing happens because the density is too low, and the examples were. So my question is to say something more about, in the final part of the paper, there is just a short mention of the fact that there are young architects and young artists which are doing something for going in the other direction. And so I would like you to say something more about that because I think it is very interesting. About the paper of Patrick Galès, which is a very brilliant paper, and he attacks a number of taken for granted ideas about cities. And so I have a number of questions because he is very provocative in a way. So he says that cities are not more divided, but less divided in a way. He says that between 2015 and 2014, no increase in income inequalities in city. And for example, I remember that a research that's been done by a colleague, Daniele Checchi, here at the end of the 90s. He said that Milan in the 70s, early 70s, was the least unequal city in Lombardy, which was the least unequal city region in Italy. And then at the end of the 90s, Milan was the most unequal city in Lombardy, which became the most unequal region in Italy. And so my point is that maybe everything happened before this period that you have been mentioning in the paper. Then there is this observation, which is also provocative, the fact that the financial cuts have not been so severe. Public expenditure is higher in percentage of the GDP compared with 2007. And so since we are discussing and we are seeing that there are continuous decrease in the availability of money in the municipalities for providing services, I think that probably the kind of money which has been spent has been displaced in different places. And you are discussing, you haven't taken this point in your short presentation, but you are saying something about housing poverty, which I think is maybe something which is very evident in a way in producing a certain type of inequality which is not represented by the percentage of GDP, but it is something which is menacing the cohesion in our city. And of course, you also recognize that there is an increase in segregation, which is also leading to the paper of Oberti and Preteceille. The problem of the increase in segregation is also something which is not represented by the amount of expenses, but it's something which is also producing something very important in terms of impairing social cohesion. Then I have a last point about the fact that about the type of city you are discussing, because in this period between your book, your first important book, and nowadays a process of enlarging of the city, of creating this kind of city regions has become more and more important. And so I'm wondering if this does any difference in your reflection. And for the paper of Oberti and Preteceille, I found also very interesting this idea, so this description of something which has not been very much discussed, at least in my environment. So the fact that the most segregated class is the upper class, which is a self-segregation. And then the second most segregated class is the working class, which is not self-segregation, but is something which is happening. And this is very important, I think, at the level of the urban region, not only at the level of the city, because they are going also outside. And then this idea of middle class, which is split in different parts, which are the less segregated, but despite the myth of gentrification, but at the same time, they belong in a way to other types of segregation. So my point is segregation increasing And if it is increasing, isn't it really a problem which is not due to planning, and so the detachment between the different groups of people, which is going to the point of Richard Sennett, is something which is not due to policies, but it is something which is happening and menacing the social cohesion. And finally, the paper of Enrica Morlicchio is a wonderful case in Naples for this, also for discussing the point of Richard Sennett, because really it is the city in which you really see this kind of mixture of physical closeness between people, this touching, and at the same time it's very poor, and it's a very high rate of unemployment, really with great difficulties in coming out from this very lasting crisis. So this is not enough, as you said, and so I'm wondering if this is producing some kind of resilience to the crisis. Probably yes, so this is my question. Because of what Richard Sennett said, but at the same time it's not enough, and so we have to think to other kind of policies. These are my observations.
Yes, it works now. Well, first of all, I have to apologize with the author because I am not really an expert on these topics. But in order to discuss the paper, I will use some categories that are completely, or more or less, quite completely exogenous from your theoretical approach. So we'll try to use other categories. For discussing the paper of Richard Sennett, I will use the concept of the flaneur. To discuss the paper of Galès, I will use the theory of rock and the old European city belt. I will start from the Middle Age. To discuss the other from Oberti and Preteceille, I will use the concept of urban system. You see, they are completely exogenous, no, to your framework. And then for the last, I will use the concept of the non-resident population. So let's start with Richard Sennett. In your paper, you present quite clear dichotomies concerning city. We have planned and unplanned city, controlled and a struggling city, user-friendly and engaging city, with fixed meaning and interpretable city. And we can include also the concept of the serendipity. And if I quote what you say on page 195, all buildings have programs which define the particular use of spaces. Modern buildings tend to have particularly defined programs. And then you say again, these easy to use but rigidly fixed structures ask for submission in use rather than engagement. And then the last sentence is that user-friendly turns out to be socially unfriendly. So the idea that you give us is that these are quite difficult cities to live in, just as you described. But then you introduce a very interesting concept. It is the concept of the risk. Risk. That we can risk in some way in order to touch the city, in order to capture the genius loci of the city. But what does it mean to risk a little bit? In my opinion, and here I can quote a concept that is the concept of the half-suicide. We have to kill a little bit ourselves. Not completely, but it's a kind of half-suicide, not completely suicide. This is a classical metaphor from the psychoanalytic approach. What does it mean? It means these things that in order to avoid any personal prejudice, in order to be completely free from other kind of prejudice, I have to keep myself, of course, is a kind of metaphor, in order to capture the genius loci, in order to really touch the city, to destroy myself in order to touch the city. This is a classical psychoanalytic concept, and of course, it is not a complete suicide, because you always find an emergency exit. At the end, you touch the city, but not completely. You stop to have this kind of relationship, deeper relationship with the city. You stop to be a classical flaneur, and you come back to be an intellectual, to write the book, to take the picture. So this is something that I remember very closely. Benjamin, as a matter of fact, you use also the concept of porosity, for example, no? Yeah. So my question now arrived directly, and I can quote Pierpaolo Pasolini, the flaneur of the Roman periphery, and he was used to say, "Each night I explore the city. I am not sure to return home. I am risking a lot. I am not sure that it will be possible for me to back. But if I am back at home, I will be richer than before, thanks to the new experience." So this is the idea of the risk. In order to risk, you have in some way to stop to be yourself. So I come to the question. It is difficult to risk, of course. We avoid many times to risk. So my question is, do you think that flaneurs and flaneuses, because you have also feminine flaneurs and flaneurs, are still existing? Are they able to constitute an alternative to tourists in exploring the city and in capturing the genius lodge of the city? Are they able to use all the 5 senses in touching the city? Are still existing this kind? Because you know they are kind of poor Senex. No? They are in the middle between having the desire of having experience, but at the same time they are Senes. They know when they have to stop. So you present this picture. It's nice to match with this population, but completely or not completely. So when you stop to match with this population, so this is another thing that it could be interesting to analyze. We know that it's very difficult to be flaneur in our society. As Benjamin told us, the flaneur many times becomes part of the market. At the end, in the theory of Benjamin, he's the sandwich man. He's part of the market. He's not able to constitute an alternative to this situation. So if you can say something about this. Then I go to the paper of Patrick Galès, very nice paper. But in my opinion, what is missing, but as I already told before, I am not expert. I have the feeling that what is missing in the paper is the analysis of the external variables that make possible the evolution of the European cities. In the history, sometimes something happens. In a few minutes, I will tell you what happens, for example, in the Middle Age. In the Middle Age, what Roccan told us, that we have the development of the city that were located in the central part of Europe, starting from the North Italy, going to Switzerland, and then the Netherlands and Germany. This was the whole European city belt. And it was characterized by middle-sized city, and it was possible for the city to develop very fastly because also for the climatic condition, but everything was due to the fact that the Mediterranean area, the Mare Nostrum, was not the best place to develop trade and commercial activity because of the Ottoman invasion. So there was an external variables that make possible that the route of the commercial activity was extremely changed the direction. So if you can say something concerning the external variable, and in our case, the globalization process, the immigration process, that can change, maybe in an unpredictable way, the development of the corridor, of the European corridor. Maybe something can happen. No? In the past, it was interesting, the lecture before that we have concerning the Mediterranean Sea. You know that because of the invasion of the Ottoman Navy, that generates this shift of the development of the European corridor. No, it was just for change. It was unpredictable. So do we have to consider also these unpredictable variables in describing the future of the European city? It's another job. And then we have Oberti and Preteceille. You say something about differences between large city and middle-sized city, but reading the paper, reading the chapter, I have the idea that you describe a general evolution without making a lot of distinction between different models, between Italy, between French, and so it was, I didn't understand if it was possible to define different patterns. Why I use the concept of urban system? Because urban system is very important. For example, you can make a distinction between a monocephalic urban system, a big city, and the desert, more or less, and the polycephalic system, like Italian. So a system made by middle-sized city. This changed a lot, probably all the evolution of the dynamics that you described, no? And the middle-sized city, you can find also, it was a little bit quoted, maybe Le Galès. Le Galès says something about this kind of network of middle-sized cities. So to consider a polycephalic system is very different from considering a monocephalic system. A network of middle-sized city generated different type of problems, different type of local welfare. So can you say something about maybe distinction between different type of patterns? And then the last of Morlicchio. Of course, all the paper and also the chapter are very nice, including this, the last one of Enrica. What I would say, in my opinion, I think that is the time now to make a step forward in the analysis of our neighborhood. As I told before, I use the concept of resident and non-resident population. You describe the local population, I mean, you say if you have social polarization, what happens during the day? We have a lot of commuters, we have a lot of tourists. They change completely the profile of the city. The problem is that we know this, but this is very difficult to measure. It's very difficult to analyze what is going on in the city according to the classical statistical sources. We have data concerning census data, so people sleeping in the city, having a house in the city, but not people moving in the city and visiting the city every day. So I think that the future in this sector will be the one that in which you can merge new information concerning not only local population, but also non-resident. By non-resident, I don't mean immigrants. I mean commuter, city user. And this also because I come back, the last consideration was about also Benjamin. He was comparing Moscow and Naples and saying that they have a typical thing, a porosity. They both have a kind of porosity. But this kind of porosity was an example concerning the fact that the city was used by different type of population, moving, for example, from the public space to the private space. No, and when you move from the public space to the private space, you have to consider different kind of population performing this kind of activity. Okay, finish.
Well, I hope the speaker will be up to the task. So who is going to start? Enrica, would like to start?
I am very brief. And thank you very much for your comments. And I can answer to Professor Balducci with an example that is based on a research that I made with Elena De Filippo using in-depth interview. We interview immigrants that choose Naples as areas of first arrivals in the 18th and 19th of the last century, and after obtaining their permission to stay, they moved to north of Italy, in the northeast, but also in Lombardia, for example, and after the crisis, they lost their job, and they decided to come back to Naples, that was the areas of first arrivals. And in the interview, they say that they come back to Naples because of the togetherness, because they knew that in Naples they can rely on informal networks of mutual support. But as I said before, that were not enough, because a lot of these people, after some months, became homeless. So we interviewed them in the Center for Homeless. And so I think that you never get used to poverty. So when the crisis hits a poor area where you can rely only on informal network of solidarity, the effects are stronger, not less strong. And for example, it also, in the case of the families, one of the effects of the crisis is that the overburden on the families increases a lot compared with the reduction of economic resources. And some families were not able anymore to act the forms of internal solidarity, which is very often a forced solidarity. And it is very impossible for me to answer to your question. I think that's very interesting, your comments on the resident, non-resident population. I am a commuter, so I know that there is important differences, but I need the help of urban sociologists, and I am not an urban sociologist, so to take in consideration this aspect. I have not the tools to do that now, but I think that the city during the day is very different of the city in the evening. I agree with you totally.
Oh, if you order me, then what can I say? Thank you. Yeah, tour de force to do these comments you've done, both of you. First one, Sandro, of course you're right on a number of things you mentioned, but my argument is really, let's be precise and qualify those mechanisms about inequality and stop having this general explanation that are just wrong empirically. There's an important argument in Fernand Braudel, in his method, and I'm thinking about what's been said about Middle Ages. And Braudel says, well, when you don't know exactly what's going on, try to frame the issue. He calls that la pesée. Try to get some element to know under which parameters you can understand some of those things. That's exactly what I'm arguing in the paper. Is that instead of saying, more inequalities, cities are more divided on everything, it's everything the same thing going on, let's try at least to be precise on some of the parameters under which we can work much more precisely on inequalities, like my friends have been doing at the local level. So that's really the sake of the argument in many ways. So you may have, on average, some limited inequalities, but that doesn't tell you that you may have huge amount of differences at very, very different level. And as we know, when we work on urban inequalities, we do several things. We, number one, know that when you look at differences of inequalities of income, may be very different from the inequalities in terms of access to services, but might be themselves very different from inequalities in terms of patrimonio that people have, but might be also very different from some of the social segregation elements. So the way we combine may take very different way. It doesn't mean that they are not more divided on a number of issues, but my point is also we should not, I'm a comparatist. I want us to be more precise on under which parameters we can control and we can see some element. And it's also a plea in the urban studies literature nowadays, which tend to marginalize social sciences, to really take seriously the politics and the policies of a city. European cities and city regions are organized historically with very strong political and policies element. As you know, we have literature emphasizing philosophical ideas and emphasizing post-politics and all these things, but that's not what we see. And I want to emphasize that in some cases, those policies make a huge difference. And in social science, in urban studies, we tend to sort of disconnect them. So I want to give indicators that you see some very different results at the end. There is less poverty in Finland than in France, and there are reasons for that. Yes, the UK is an exception in Europe, and yes, we have seen severe cuts in welfare, making a huge difference when in some other countries, when you work on income tax or inheritance tax, you make a difference over time. So my point was not to do the more precise thing, as you argue, and you're absolutely right. It's just that let's try to be precise in our comparative framework on the settings under which we operate. Same thing what you say about municipalities. Of course, you're right. There is some austerity in a number of cases, but the point is that on average, again, you still have a huge amount of policies going on. But that does not mean that many municipalities are now lacking resources to do more. But still, when you compare that with other parts of the world, Europe is a complete exception with the amount of social policy we're doing. And, I'm very much in favor of trying to understand those small incremental processes that will have long-term consequence in terms of inequality. But that should not be mixed with radical cuts and very strong process going on in some other parts of the world. I'm always worried that if we put all that in the same bag, we lose the relevance of very strong policies in some cases. That's more the spirit, but I agree with you on a number of issues. And